most common vulnerabilities you've found in your penetration tests, and how can businesses protect against them?
I'll share a series of common vulnerabilities we see. One we string together into attack, and an attack that we're successful with nearly every time. Now, it will take me some time to step through this, but I think you'll see how we go from knowing nothing to having remote access into your network, and then finding and exporting all of your data, all without doing anything sophisticated, and all with vulnerabilities that most organizations risk accept. In other words, what I'm about to walk through, most organizations would be vulnerable to. First, we'll start with metadata and documents on your main website. Metadata that contains information about hardware and software being used in your environment, geolocation information, and oftentimes usernames. Having a list of usernames from document metadata allows us to determine your domain username convention. Often it's the same as the first part of your email address, which is a terrible practice, by the way, or otherwise something easily derived from knowing people's names. To mitigate that, you need to keep document metadata scrubbed and use a username convention not based on the person's name. Next, we find a list of your employee names, either from LinkedIn or in some industries, such as law firms, they have a online directory open to the public. Or a third option, we just download a list of, let's say, the 10,000 most common first and last names and use that. From this information, we generate a list of tens of thousands of possible usernames. So a large percentage that will not be valid, but we don't know yet which are valid and which are not. Next, we find a user enumeration vulnerability. And nearly every time, rare not to find this. Basically, we find a service that either through the difference in timing or perhaps even just it straight up tells us, we can determine whether a provided username is valid or not. By exploiting that and feeding in that huge list of possible usernames, we produce a list of known valid usernames. If you use Microsoft O365 or Azure services, for example, then your external services are near guaranteed to be vulnerable to this attack because Microsoft has risk accepted this attack on your behalf. It's common to see this risk accepted, but we just got one of 3 pieces of information that we need to take over your network. So please stop risk accepting this. Next, most users are forced to change their passwords periodically. Example, every 90 days you're forcing your users to change their passwords for no reason whatsoever. It won't have any meaningful impact on protecting you against a breached password, which is going to be used in minutes or a few days anyway once it's breached. And this practice has been advised against by NIST and OWASP and other standards for more than a decade now. The reason being, when your users are forced to change their passwords every 90 days, for example, the passwords will be very predictable. In fact, we have an internal script that generates a short list of passwords for us that reliably compromises 25 to 30% of your users' passwords. So your 90-day password rotation policy is actually worse than useless. It's actually going to be your downfall. So I beg you, I cannot beg you enough, disable your password expiration policy. On that note, get an identity management solution that restricts the use of passwords that are less than 14 characters long, or weak passwords, or compromised passwords, and so on. Next, we find an external service to test your credentials against. The corporate identity management solution, such as Active Directory is the most common. A service such as Citrix Remote Access or email or whatever your company uses. And then we launch a password spray against that external service. Basically, we take one of those easy to predict passwords made possible due to your misguided password expiration policy that we just talked about. A password such as Spring 2024 ! We try that password across all of the accounts. We may try like 2 or 3 more passwords that are common like that, depending on your policy. But then we pause for long enough that your failed password count resets, so we don't lock out any accounts. Or, fun trick, we don't stop, we don't put a pause in it, and we lock out all of your accounts, and your business grinds to a halt. That's because another misguided policy is to lock out your accounts after, let's say, 5 failed login attempts, rather than a smarter policy of, let's say, banning the IP address, the attacker IP address, or maybe an exponential increase in timeouts, or just a number of other much better approaches than locking out an account that don't introduce this. I mean, it's a denial of service vulnerability that you're introducing when you're locking out accounts. But let's assume we wait, so we go slow enough to prevent lockouts. Then we try another batch of passwords, another 2, 3, 4 passwords, whatever it is. It's not uncommon for us to do this and get through about 200 passwords per day. And within just a couple of days, with less than 1,000 passwords, we historically compromise 25% of your user accounts. We can rotate our IP address if needed, but we rarely have to. This attack is often missed. Your MFA, or multi-factor authentication, could protect you against all of this. The user enumeration and the password spring and more, if MFA were configured securely. But it fails to kick in until after the password is confirmed. In fact, 99.9% of all of the services we test are vulnerable to this attack that I just described. So you can already see how dangerous it is to risk accept this stuff. I can count on one hand the number of securely configured MFA implementations we've seen, ever. Let me explain that in another way. Back in the day, the login screen would have a username box, it would have a password box, and then it would have a third box for your RSA token. If any of those were wrong, you just got a failed login message. You didn't know which one it was. But usability drove us to where everyone is now, where an attacker is able to verify a password before MFA ever kicks in. So please secure your MFA and then have us test it for you. So we've compromised 25% of your users' passwords at this point, without sending a single phishing email, by the way, or anything sophisticated. A common misconception is, even though that we have 25% of your users' passwords now, that we can't get past MFA. That is what we like to call mistaken. It's easy to bypass MFA in a number of ways. A new account without MFA that prompts us to set it up after we log in and we just set up our phone. Or partial adoption rate. So, Fred over in accounting has been employed for 32 years but has never logged in remotely. So he's never set up his MFA. But, no worries. When we log into his account, we'll set it up on our phone. Or another bypass option is we send an MFA push notification. And I have to be honest here, attackers love push MFA notifications. It's far less secure than even SMS or text-based MFA, which, as I'm sure you've heard, isn't necessarily that great. About 20% of your users will accept the push out of habit, out of muscle memory. So if we have, let's say, 5 or 6 compromised accounts, we have nearly a 100% chance of getting into your network because someone's going to accept that push for us. Or a related approach, we send dozens of push requests to a user until they get so annoyed they accept the push just so it stops. And then we get in. In our experience, SMS or text-based MFA is actually more secure than push MFA. Push notification MFA, I cannot emphasize how terrible it is. But we would recommend more secure options over push it MFA or SMS-based MFA, and certainly over email-based MFA. That's the worst. For example, push MFA then includes number match, so the user has to think logically by doing some simple math. This seems to be a decent balance of usability, but also mitigates much of that muscle memory response that we see. Another way we bypass MFA, we find a service that doesn't have MFA. There seems to always be at least one of those. And there's plenty of other ways that we bypass MFA, but you get the idea. Again, just to summarize, I can count on one hand the number of times we've seen MFA securely configured across the network, much less a 100% adoption rate. Now that we have access to multiple accounts, we gain remote access to a workstation as a standard user. Then again, we may pop an IT admin with a weak password, which makes for a really awkward debrief call later. Regardless of the privileges of the accounts that we compromise, we privilege escalate to local admin on the box that we're on, or a privileged domain account, or even domain admin. Examples, keylogger to catch IT admin credentials, credentials on a local or network share, example like a startup script, or LLMNR attacks, which is basically a man-in-the-middling legacy protocols, or internal phishing, or 1,000 other ways. So super common. It seems we always find a way to privilege escalate. Next, we laterally move to sensitive systems using whatever privileges we have obtained. And internal firewalls rarely stop us when we do this. A fun one is to pivot to multi-function devices or printers. They usually have default credentials that let us in, and they can be reached by any endpoint, so no firewalls are blocking us. And they have really cool debug features sometimes, even like packet capture. So we could run and capture all of those user sessions authenticating with legacy insecure protocols, for example. Or we just add our email address and set up a carbon copy for anything printed or scanned and get it sent to us. A common way we gain access to much of your data is we crawl all of your internal open network shares. We always find a ton of these. And we download all kinds of useful data. Rarely does this get detected either. In addition to containing a ton of PII, personally identifiable information, these shares, especially with those startup scripts, these shares often contain things like service account passwords, which of course allows us to compromise even more systems and data. Once we collect all of your data, we stage it for Exfil. Now, for our testing, we typically swap out the real data here with synthetic or fake data because we want to avoid an actual data breach, of course. But from there, we take that data and we push that data out of your network. We do it in many different ways, but common is just HTTP. It blends right in with your web traffic, doesn't get caught or detected. DLP solutions rarely detect it, especially if that is HTTPS traffic. Worst case scenario, we may have to zip up the data and then change the first 2 bytes, known as the magic bytes, which is what DLP looks for when determining a file type. So worst case scenario, we're changing out those first 2 bytes and it's going to fool your DLP solution like every time. Rarely is that huge outbound data transfer noticed. Even if it does get noticed, that data is already long gone by that point. This attack scenario I went through, it strings together multiple examples of vulnerabilities or potential weaknesses in a client network that are often risk accepted or perhaps not even considered vulnerabilities. Yet I just demonstrated how we can often combine these low-level risk accepted vulnerabilities to obtain full network and data compromise. And this doesn't include the other common ways we breach networks and data every day. The bottom line is, give us a call and we can help determine what attacks are possible in your network.